Hello, Alan, and welcome back to In Conversation.
Hello, James. Nice to see you again.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And of course, we're going to be talking about your book, Sight Readings, Photographers in American Jazz, 1900 to 1960. And we're celebrating the book's 1 year anniversary. So
We
I
are.
think to
Yeah.
begin with, congratulations are in
Thank
order.
you. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that reviewers have picked out. So the book's been described as a fascinating and groundbreaking contribution to the subject. Reviewers have described Sight Readings as a milestone, the definitive book on jazz photography. So high praise and well deserved.
Yeah, the reviews have been great. Yeah, very pleased. Yes.
Well, Alan, to begin with, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because I know you're an independent writer, a professional photographer in the fields of architecture, design, jazz, and photographic history, and you've published several books on many different topics. So maybe just give us a little bit about your own history and your own practice.
Yes, of course. Well, I trained as a historian, academic historian, and I did a PhD in British political history. But I've never taught for any extended period in academic institutions. I taught for a few years after completing my doctoral thesis, and then went into business for about 20 years, which I combined with photography. So during that period, I was a semi-professional, strictly speaking. But I turned professional about 25 years ago as a photographer. And over that time, I've worked commercially as an architectural photographer, mostly working for major architectural firms in London. But along the way, as you say, I produced a number of books on architecture, either myself as a writer and photographer or working with other architectural writers and me as a photographer. Of course, I've always been interested in jazz. That's been there really since I was young. And during this period, both as a semi-professional and a professional photographer, I have photographed jazz musicians, and I've been doing that for a long time now. And so I combined that, much in the way that many of the photographers I wrote about, and we'll no doubt talk about, did. They combined it with commercial work, which obviously where they earned their money, but had a great love of the music. So in that respect, I'm very similar to quite a number of the photographers that I write about. But of course, it was that training as a historian, which came together with the experience of photographing jazz musicians, that really formed the two background factors that led on to my writing the book we're going to talk about. So that perhaps gives you the kind of background you were looking for.
Very much so, yeah. And I think your background is very important in how the book has been sort of undertaken, and it's one of the reasons why it's such an important volume. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the archival research you undertook to produce these images? Because the book contains 136 illustrations, and as you've mentioned, many of them are never before seen or of lesser known photographers. A lot of work of African American photographers and Jewish photographers as well. So it'd just be good to unpack that. How did you engage with the source material? What kind of archives did you use? How did you encounter these unknown photographers? Just tell us a bit about your research and how that led to you curating these wonderful illustrations that form the backbone of the book.
Yes, I think I visited about 15 or 18 different archives in America during the course of the research. And how did I find them? Well, I suppose I started with the most well-known archives, the Schomburg Center for Black History in New York, the Getty, Library of Congress. But you move on from there. You discover things in the course of the research, and you end up going to archives that I'd never heard of. And in one or two cases, archives where no one had been in to look at the photographs that I was specifically interested in. Perhaps an example might help to illustrate it. The Bradley Center for Black American History at California State University, Northridge, has a really quite important collection of work by a number of West Coast Black photographers, many of whom had a real interest in jazz. And I went there, and I'd never been there before. Drove up from LA into Northridge, and they welcomed me. They were absolutely terrific. They really were. The archivist, a guy called Keith Rice, was just wonderful. He really was. And I went a few times, and Keith showed me into a room, big room full of underlying shelving, and he said, "Well, help yourself. Most of this hasn't been processed yet, but here you go." So I think it's examples like that which show that, although photography is now well researched, jazz photography isn't particularly well researched, but you can go into archives like that and you can find material that's not been addressed. And I think it's really quite exciting to do that, and quite stimulating. And it's terribly important for the photographers involved, because a lot of the photographers I found, particularly at the Bradley Centre, had not had much exposure and have been overlooked.
It sounds like you took quite a journey across the United States, which must have been really fun, and like physically visiting these spaces. But were you quite reliant also on technology? Did you have to do a lot of research using sort of the internet, or was it really kind of find into one archive, find one resource, and then leads to another, jump in the car, jump on the train, and head to the next stop? Or was there a lot more kind of piecing things together?
It was mainly piecing things together, I'd say. So far as the archival research was concerned, I did start with the web, and I followed leads, and I went to the websites of various archives. And if it looked promising, my next step was normal. Promising because I'd had a look at the finding aids and had a look at the catalogues, and it seemed to be information there. I normally make contact with the curator, and curators as a group of people are just wonderful people. It's really helpful,
vitally important as well, and underrated.
I mean, they really are wonderful, and they would help, and they'd go away, and I tell them what I was interested in, they go away and research it. The way I organised the trips was not so much to go to one archive and then jump in a car and go to another, but rather plan. I actually did 6 research visits to the US in total. Over a period of about 3.5 years.
Wow.
And what I did was to plan to visit about 5 or 6 different archives on each trip.
Well, it sounds like the work you're doing, of course, is really important, as is the work of these archivists. And it does lead me to question, how much of these photographs do you think are still to be found? Do you think there's a wealth and depth of material still out there? Or do you think a lot of it's been lost? I mean, is there a lot of restoration to be done?
There's a wealth of material there. And, if I could, I'd follow up quite a few things that I unearthed during the course of this research and didn't have time, or it didn't fit into the particular slant of the book.
And is it a real sort of aim of yours through the book, that this leads on to other researchers, maybe from different disciplines as well, taking the work that you've done and following on with some of these photographers and looking into things in more depth?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. And in a sense, that is exactly what I did, with books by particularly Benjamin Cawthra's book, Blue Notes in Black and White. I read that book. I probably had my book in mind for a couple of years and been researching it, and I read Benjamin Cawthra's book, and I thought, well, my first thought was disappointment. I thought he'd done what he had to do. But actually, when I read it again, I realized what he had done was to open up a large number of avenues for exploration. His being really the first comprehensive book on jazz photography, scholarly book on jazz photography. And when I met him during the course of one of my trips, I mean, he was just delightful. He said, look, this is what I was hoping. I was hoping someone would pick. Inevitably, the book was the first on the subject. Inevitably, I couldn't cover everything. I was hoping that someone would pick it up and follow through other themes. So in a sense, that's what I did. And I'm quite sure there are a lot of ideas and themes in my book which would be well worth following up. And there are other photographers still to discover.
Well, moving on to themes then, the book is sort of written around 10 chapters, and tell us a bit about how you happened upon those chapters, how you decided to write them, and a little bit about the book's structure and the themes that are present in it.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the main themes in the book is that there are a number of different types of jazz photography, and it's worth. I came to the conclusion very quickly that it was worth having a chapter on each of these different types of photography, because I don't think that those differences have been sufficiently recognised in the writing on the subject, and a lot of the writing, a lot of the scholarship does tend to focus on a relatively narrow canon of white art photographers. So a number of the chapters are around those particular types of photography, and they really start with chapter 5, which looks at jazz in the portrait studio. Portraiture has not often been looked at in the jazz context, but terribly important because it was this interface between jazz musicians and the world of commercial entertainment.
Right.
The next two chapters look at African American photography, focusing on jazz. One on the early period in New Orleans, and the other on the later period, in particular the work of American black photojournalists. Chapter 8 looks at the white photographers, who are mainly operating in an art context in commercial practices.
Right.
And chapter 9 looks at the work of emigre photographers and Jewish photographers, particularly the Jewish exiles in the early part of the period and in the 1930s. So those chapters really are the core of the book, looking at the specific types of photography, and they're bookended really with a couple of themes. Before we get into the chapter on jazz in the portrait studio, I take a general look at jazz photography, survey the history, and I look at the scholarship around the nature of the photograph, and in particular I focus on documentary images and expressive images in order to bring those two themes into the specific chapters as I go into them. And then towards the end, I have a final chapter which looks forward from 1960 and just sort of builds on the analysis that I presented in the book so far in the work of photographers after about 1960. It's a fairly brief survey, and I think if there's anywhere where someone might want to pick up the themes that I developed and take it forward, it's probably in the post-1960 work. So that's roughly how it's structured, and as you can see, it's really around the sort of central core of the different types of jazz photography, which really was one of my key aims, was to bring out the diversity and the social context and the artistic practices in which that diversity arose.
Well, let's delve a little deeper into that then, because that sounds fascinating, and I think that is also one of the areas where the book is so important. So perhaps we could begin with white art photography, because that sounds like quite a provocative term, and you say that a lot of the white photographers involved in jazz practice were coming from a commercial angle. So is that more of the studio type work, or
yeah, studio advertising, general commercial practice, album covers, if they were working in music. I call them the white art photographers. These are the photographers that if you pick up any book on jazz and it contains photographs,
right,
you are more than you are most likely to see their images. And these are the photographers who are most well known within jazz scholarship and amongst jazz fans. And I'm thinking here about people like William Gottlieb, the famous photographer and downbeat writer. Herman Leonard is particularly well known. William Claxton, Bob Willoughby, one of the movie studio photographer, Dennis Stock, and a few others similar to them, some of whom are nowhere near as well known. And it's these photographers that really dominate the discussion of jazz photography. And obviously one of the things I have tried to do is to raise the question as to whether or not that there is a wider tradition which also needs to be examined. The reason that I look at the different types of photography is that I think different photographers approach the subject in different ways. And many of the white photographers were operated within the context of commercial practice. So they were earning their money doing portraiture or advertising work or publicity work or marketing work. Or in some cases, there were film studio photographers. And jazz was their love, jazz was their interest. And what I found when I looked at the biography of most of these photographers was that they they came to jazz early in life, they loved the music. And that's reflected in the way in which they photographed musicians. They photographed them really as accomplished artists. They wanted to bring out the artistry of a black art form. And most of the photography is performance photography. Most of it's, in many respects, decontextualized because it's performers on stage,
Right.
Often in very dark backgrounds because of the nature of performance spaces. So it's very much a portrayal, an artistic portrayal. It's very much a portrayal of a cultural activity as a cultural accomplishment, as a sort of supreme form of artistic expression. And that's what they found in jazz, and that's what they tried to illustrate in their photography.
And are these the kind of images that, I mean, to me, as a layman, would be how I would think jazz has been represented culturally? The kind of in a dynamic performance, you know, very sweaty, impassioned, that kind of image. Is that the type of thing that you mean?
Yes, Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers. There is a 3-hour recording of an interview with Herman Leonard.
Okay.
Herman Leonard was dead by the time I did the research, so I couldn't talk to him. But Tad Hirschhorn, who is the archivist there, had interviewed Leonard, and I listened to Leonard's interview a couple of times, and I was struck by the phrase which he kept using over and over again, which was the look of jazz. And sometimes he'd talk about the way jazz musicians dressed and how he loved how fashionable they were, you know, how fantastic they looked on stage. Sometimes he'd talk about their presence on stage. And I think that is a very good insight into the way in which many of these white photographers approach jazz. I mean, they were captivated by it. They wanted to celebrate it. And this idea of the look of jazz, that jazz has a specific visuality about it, is something which you find in their work. And as you rightly said, the cover of the book is a very good example of that.
It's certainly like there's certain iconography that one would definitely think epitomizes jazz, and I think the cover definitely does that.
Yeah.
And how would that then differ from some of the African American photographers that you've happened upon and that you've really reappraised through the book? Because I know that there were...
Well, the black photographers, first of all, were operating in a very different context.
Right.
They were photographing jazz and jazz musicians as part of a wider practice. Most of them were photojournalists. Most of them were photographing musicians much as they might photograph black sportsmen who came, who were sort of icons of black achievement. And you find a much greater emphasis on the context in which jazz is performed and the context in which these musicians emerged. So rather than being dominated by photographs of performance spaces and musicians on stage, you find a lot of photographs in their work of musicians meeting local members of the community. When Duke Ellington comes into Pittsburgh, for instance, local photographers with the black press would photograph him, possibly not even during performance, but certainly with his fans. Because this is how they regarded these musicians. They regarded them as exemplars of black achievement, exemplars of black culture. So they were more concerned to contextualize it, more concerned to put the achievements of these musicians back in the context of the community from which they emerged. And there are plenty of examples in the book of well-known, well, just to give one example, I mean, I have a wonderful photograph of Count Basie, not on sitting in front of a piano, but a local chap giving him a packet of cigarettes.
Right.
And that sort of thing you find a lot. And I think this is a big difference. It's a big difference in the way in which black photographers saw jazz and approached it, and hence photographed it. compared with the white photographers who we were talking about a moment ago.
Well, yeah, maybe tell us a bit more about how you encountered some of those photographers and some of the key photographs in the book that you think are really important.
Yes, I devoted 2 chapters, as I said previously, to black photography, because I wanted to look at a number of the early photographers who do tend to get overlooked a little bit. Photographers like Arthur Bedu and Villar Padio in New Orleans, James Van der Zee, Edward Elcher in New York, and a number of studios like Woodard's studio, which was a black, very, very successful black portrait studio. And black musicians would go there to get their portraits done, to get publicity portraits done. But the early photographers, I think, were very important, and a lot of the early photographs we have show musicians, particularly New Orleans photographs, show the bands in which, the orchestras in which musicians appeared. And this is really an indication of just how important the band and the orchestra was in the New Orleans tradition.
Yeah.
And then a bit later on, there were a number of black photojournalists around the country. Benny Joseph in New Orleans, Ernest Withers in Memphis, a number in New York City, Austin Hanson, Marvin and Morgan Smith, Clarence Williams on the West Coast. They all were different mixtures of studio photojournalists. And again, they would capture images of jazz musicians in the way I've described as part of their general practice. And then there were a few on the West Coast, like Bob Douglas, Harry Adams, Ted Williams, Howard Moorhead, who were a little more specifically focused on jazz, even though they, of course, had wider practices and had to earn their living in other ways. The only black photographer who really has been recognized as part of the jazz photography canon is Milt Henderson. And he's very unusual in many respects. He's quite unlike the photographers that I just mentioned because he himself was a musician. And of course, he had the in. He was in studios with other musicians, and he photographed them virtually during the whole of his career.
And then would you say that some of the white photographers that you mentioned earlier, it's almost more voyeuristic and more about kind of the performance and in that kind of space as well, and less about the kind of day-to-day?
Well, I'm not sure I'd use the word voyeuristic, although there is this. It is a charge that has been levelled against them. But I think I wouldn't describe it as voyeuristic because virtually all these photographers were committed to jazz. They loved the music, and they wanted, where they could, to celebrate the achievements of the black musicians. And therefore, I don't think it's like a commercial photographer going in, doing a fashion shoot with someone he's never met before, goes away, and that's the end of it. It wasn't a transactional relationship in that sense. Sure, they do the odd portrait. Sure, they do album covers, but actually they had a close relationship with the musicians. So I don't think it was voyeuristic in the sense that they were close to the musicians, and the way they were approaching it was very much in the spirit of what they saw as being an artistic activity being delivered in a supremely competent fashion.
And I guess the period that the book covers, it covers the civil rights movement as well. And is that something you discuss in the book? And is there anything you'd highlight around that?
Jazz? I mean, there are a number of photographers, particularly black photographers, in the capacity as photojournalists who did a lot of work in the civil rights movement. Ernest Withers in Memphis is one of them, and is known for the work he did in that area.
Right.
And as photojournalists, the black photographers would cover that just as much as they would cover jazz or sporting activities or church and religious events or social activities. Clearly, it was a very important part. This is particularly the case on the West Coast. I mean, a lot of the photographers that I mentioned on the West Coast in the 60s and early 70s were certainly concerned to document the effects of, for example, the Watts riots.
Right.
And again, they're doing that as part of their broad activities, and they're photographing jazz musicians at the same time. You cannot help but make the connections between the two.
Well, another thing that interests me as well then is, I guess, again, from a layman's perspective, you when encountering jazz photography and its history, you often think of New York and for me, New Orleans. But you mentioned Memphis, and I imagine that there's a huge, and the West Coast, and I imagine there's a huge number of slightly less known cities across the United States that have a real heritage, or have had an important place that's perhaps less known. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I would. I mean, good example, Seattle.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, again, not a clue. Right. Yeah.
Al Smith, photographer in Seattle.
Okay.
And, I actually wrote a reasonable chunk about Al Smith in the book. Really good photographer, vibrant jazz scene in Seattle.
Again, new to me.
And, he was, again, one of the photographers with a broad practice, but went into the clubs to photograph the musicians and the audiences. And I think this is worth saying as well. The one thing I found is that the African American photographers are much more concerned to capture the nature of the audiences and the interaction between audiences and the musicians.
I think it'd also be interesting to hear a little bit about whether you saw any changes from 1900 through to 1960, and then you've also mentioned sort of a little bit what's happened since then. Were there any clear sort of stylistic changes? Were there clear periods where portraiture was the in thing, or more to do with the audience, or is that just was there kind of a general trajectory?
I mean, I think one of the most important nodal points really was round about the mid 1920s, when the emphasis of photography shifted from band photography, band lineups and orchestra photography, towards portraiture of individual musicians. And why did this emerge in the around about mid-20s onwards? Well, I think it's because of the emergence of jazz musicians out of the collective ensemble as individual soloists in their own right. Louis Armstrong, of course, being probably the pioneer in this respect. And Armstrong, after he'd left New Orleans, gone to Chicago and then New York, he emerges as an artist in his own right, whereas up until this point, jazz musicians had been known largely by their band affiliations. Not that they weren't known as good musicians individually, but they saw themselves as part of the collective. This is happening just at the point at which mass commercial entertainment in America is beginning to take on new forms. It's happening just at the point at which studios, the motion picture studios, are developing their own photographic They're still photography studios, are beginning to send out, by the end of the 1920s and the 1930s, tens of thousands of portrait photographs a week. And of course, for jazz musicians, this is a point of negotiation with commercial entertainment. And one of the reasons I was keen to have a chapter on the portrait studio was because it's often overlooked. But jazz musicians saw commercial portraiture as part of their development as musicians, key to their development as a career, and it illustrates the kind of negotiations between black musicians and what was undoubtedly still a white-dominated mass commercial sector.
Well, fascinating stuff, Alan, and I would really like to now draw upon some of your work on the exiles and the Jewish photography that you highlight in the book as well. Otto Hess, Henry Rees, people of that nature. And does that come out of a specific historical period, as you mentioned, emigre?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. It really comes out of two periods.
Okay.
First of all, I think the relationship between emigres and jazz is fascinating generally, because jazz as a sort of touchstone of American culture is one of the things that someone coming to the country as a newcomer has to get to grips with.
Yeah.
And for many of these photographers, it was a symbol of American culture. Really, there are two periods to look at. One is the early period. Photographers started coming to New York and then moving west from about 1880, 1890. And by 1900, 1910, there are portrait studios in New York, many of which are run by emigre photographers.
Okay.
And they were important because, as I say, there was a move by jazz musicians into the portrait studio. The second wave was in the 1930s, when many photographers, particularly Jewish photographers, were forced to leave Germany and Austria and left other Eastern European countries in their wake, came to America, sometimes via France or the United Kingdom, and established practices there. Now, what we see with that group is the way in which photography is used as a means of understanding where they are, and as a means of developing a strategy of adaptation to their new country. There's been a lot of work on the work of emigre artists, I think, which broadly speaking concludes there is no one response to emigration, but there is certainly a distance eye that artists bring to a new country, and they look at it in a different way from people who were born and brought up there. And this is certainly true of the photographers. And what I found amongst the sort of 1930s contingent, if I could put it that way, and here I'm thinking about people like Clemens Kalischer, who eventually settled in New England, John Mealy, Roman Vishniak, Lisette Model, well-known art photographer, Austrian-born, and people in New York like Henry Rees, who was a very accomplished photojournalist, and of course Francis Wolff, who founded Blue Note Records with Alfred Ryan. All German photographers who came over in the mid to late 1930s, and many were attracted to jazz because it was something they weren't necessarily familiar with. Well, Wolff was, but many weren't. But it was for them one of the icons of American culture. It was a symbol of the land where they'd arrived. And a very good example of this is that Henry Rees, the photojournalist, did a photographic survey of the Randall's Island Festival in the late 1930s. It's interesting to look through his contact sheets, which I found in the Lincoln Center in New York, because he devotes as much attention to the audience as he does to the players.
Right.
What fascinated him, this is in his autobiography, what absolutely fascinated him was that halfway through Duke Ellington's set, people got up and started dancing. And it was an integrated audience. And blacks were dancing with whites. And he says in his autobiography, this for me was something extraordinary. This is something I'd never seen in Nazi Germany.
Right.
So, it was part of the process of understanding the land they come to, part of the process for many of them of adapting to living there, in many cases permanently.
Thank you very much. There's really, again, fascinating points. And really, I just wanted to say, what kind of conclusions has all of this led to with regard to your research on jazz photography?
I think I suppose two conclusions really. What I tried to do is to get across the fact that jazz photography is so much more than just the photographing of performance and stage work. It is actually the representation of a culture. And therefore it has to be approached in a rather broad way, because there are many ways of approaching cultural manifestations. So I wanted to get across, and I suppose this is the first conclusion, the range of styles, the range of approaches, the range of expression that different types of photographers brought to the same subject, and then relate that back to and this is the second point, relate that back to the context in which they themselves were operating, social context, social, cultural, racial, and so on. And what we can see is that you can you can read a lot. Once you begin to look at it in that way, you can read a lot into the photographs. You can read a lot more than perhaps many people see.
I mean, basically, if anyone wants to find out more, what they should definitely do is go online and purchase a copy of the book from intellectbooks.com. And to celebrate the book's 1 year anniversary, we are going to be offering a 20% discount. And that will run all the way through Black History Month as well, which is taking place in February. A really important book, a really important reappraisal, and as it's been correctly highlighted, the definitive book on jazz photography, leading on from work of others, and will definitely be opening the door for people in the future. So on behalf of Intellect, thank you very much for publishing the book with us and working with us. It's a wonderful project, and I'm very glad that we've had you in today to celebrate and to discuss. So Alan, thank you very much for your time. And again, many congratulations on the 1 year anniversary.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.